Welcome to Lenten Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida.
Well, thank you, Ralph and Gretchen and Bev, for being here today and being with me as we continue our Lenten conversations about the 7 things that Jesus spoke and said from the cross. And today we're going to be delving into a kind of a weighty, difficult subject about forgiveness. One of the things that Jesus said from the cross was, he said in the Gospel of Luke, he said, "Father," or Abba, "forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Mm-hmm. And so even as Jesus was actively being crucified and in this immense suffering and pain, he was thinking of other people, not himself, and reaching out and crying out to God on behalf and petitioning for other people. So as we get into this and unpack this statement, who was Jesus pleading God to forgive? We know that he was talking to God, but who was he saying? Who was the them that he thought needed forgiveness because they didn't know what they were doing?
I had always presumed that it was not only those people that did the actual crucifixion, but also the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate and the Romans, and even perhaps some of his followers who turned against him at the end.
All right, so yeah, so you see it as a wider lens where it's not literally just specific people, it's all encompassing. Okay. Mm-hmm. How about anybody else?
Well, I feel like Bev does, that it wasn't just the soldiers, it was Judas, it was anybody that had disowned him or shunned him, even beyond the hills, beyond the people he knew.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to take it. Yeah, take it in a broad sense. It's everybody. It's kind of like what Paul says, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we're all in it together in a sense. We're all, implicated in the fact that he suffered a horrible death and we're by many in any, I guess in widest stretch, can be considered part of the human condition, which is sinful.
Thank you all for that, because I found myself sometimes getting a little bit of a tunnel vision when I read this and almost trying to pick out who exactly, he's talking about. And, we hear many biblical scholars who also want to do the same. And they're saying specifically, it's just those soldiers at his feet who are following orders, that they, I guess we could almost say blindly following orders, that's just what their job was. Not so much just because it was Jesus, but that was their form of death penalty. So crucifixion wasn't reserved for just Jesus. That was part of their culture. But I like how you are widening that up to take a bigger lens at this, because that gets to the root of forgiveness and what that means to forgive somebody. And is it conditional? I mean, does it matter if someone knows that they're doing something harmful, or are they only forgiven because they honestly don't know what they're doing?
I don't think we can make that choice. I think that forgiveness is a broad thing for all, and particularly it impressed me that it's not just for that other person, but doing forgiveness is important for us to do too, because carrying a grudge can be very harmful in our lives.
That's a great point.
I'd like to echo that too. I remember one time I was really unhappy with someone who had wronged me. And I went to a conference. It was a conference for ministers who were training to do interim work. And so one of the things that I had a bad cold, and I said to one of the we had a period where we invited to come up and pray with someone. And I went up and I said, I need to forgive someone who has wronged me. And when I said that, I began to immediately feel a sense of relief, which it had been weighing upon me. There's a wonderful saying by Confucius. He says, forgiveness is the bridge over which we must cross. If we don't forgive, we're burning down the bridge over which we must cross. And I think that's a very appropriate saying.
I've heard a somewhat of a spin on that, and let's be clear, I struggle with forgiveness. I mean, I'm human, to be honest. It's hard for me sometimes to go to a place of forgiveness when the harm has been done to me or someone I love. And I wrestle with that on what does that look like? And I've heard, it said, that forgiveness is accepting the apology that you will never receive. And I'm like, wow. Yeah, but I want someone to say it. I'm sorry.
Right.
So I guess what does forgiveness, what does it feel like, sound like, look like to each of you?
I think it's easier for me to forgive somebody who I feel has wronged me, as opposed to forgiving somebody who has done something to people that are to a people that can't defend themselves or can't speak for themselves. I think of the children at the border. I can't get past that at some level. But I don't have too much trouble accepting, forgiving somebody who has maybe said something to me or hurt me in some respect.
Well, I think you're admirable for that. I kind of agree with both points. I mean, I have trouble forgiving people who have wronged me, and I have trouble forgiving people who have wronged other people who are defenseless. I think that both of them bother me. So I admire you for being able to do that. And I think that's the statement of Jesus from the cross, forgive them. I think it's one of the most astonishing statements that I've ever heard from anybody. It's astonishing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a very weighty statement. It is.
Yeah.
It's packed with richness.
As to whether or not people people who know what they're doing as opposed to who don't know what they're doing, is whether one deserves forgiveness as over against the other. I look back on my life and I think from this perspective, I see things that I did that were really bad. And at the time, it seemed like a good idea. Only in retrospect, does it look really bad, or that I could have done something very different that would have been much better. I'll put it that way. I'm kind of reminded, because it's easy to be really confident in yourself. And I think that's when you can in most danger of making a mistake. But I'm reminded of the story about this college student who was studying under a very opinionated professor. And the professor asked him a question. And the college student thought for a minute, he was uncertain about what the answer was. And finally he says, I think, and right then the professor interrupted him and he says, I don't think, I know. And the college student said, I don't think I know either.
Was that student you?
What?
Was that student you?
No, that's just a story that I heard. It could have been, though.
I think one of the difficulties is you you say you forgive someone, but you always identify them with the thing they did. Even after you say you forgive it, it's getting away from that and trying to think of them without this.
Yeah,
Some
not forgetting.
did, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's that's a great question that you're raising, Bev. Is that does forgiveness, true forgiveness, mean that we have to forget? And then how do we recognize what is forgiveness, or how much are we still hanging on to it? And I don't know.
But I know that physiologically we can't forget because it's in our brain. And I guess it's just training ourselves not to bring that up after we have put it away,
Right.
which is
Right.
very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, it's been difficult since biblical times, because even in Proverbs 17, it says, love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well,
That's
there's
still
a
true
wonderful
today.
story. Yeah. There's a wonderful story in Charlotte Beck's book called Everyday Zen, in which she describes a situation in which a person is on a lake in a boat, and another boat bumps into it. It's foggy, let's say, and another boat bumps into that boat. Well, your immediate reaction is to say to that other, well, okay, the other person was stupid, they were ignorant, they were careless or whatever and all that. Now she says, well, imagine that other boat has nobody driving it.
Hmm.
Then you don't get mad at somebody else because there's nobody there.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of offenses that we experience can, in her view, can be looked at in that way.
Mm.
And so that we're not blaming somebody for it.
And I have to say, if I'm being honest as a broken human, there are times where I see a person, and that's what I think is, well, kind of like they didn't know what they were doing, meaning like, I don't think there's anybody driving that boat, but it's still a person. And that's judgment. That's my judgment and my way of trying to reconcile that kind of wrong.
Yeah.
Ralph, don't you have to forgive the person who didn't tie up the boat? Or is that going too far?
Right? Yeah, how far
I mean,
back does it
somebody
take that?
didn't do something.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We always want to fix blame, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Trying
Yeah.
to fix blame.
So in that statement, let's just kind of imagine for a minute that, let's say that Jesus was kind of talking directly to people who didn't know exactly what they were doing. They didn't really see the magnitude of their actions and what the ripple effect it would have. Do you believe, or do you see that is ignorance a viable defense?
Well, of course, according to the law, that's not a defense. Ignorance is no excuse. That's what the judge will tell you. If you get up in the court and you say, oh, well, I didn't know that was illegal, that's no excuse. So you have to pay. There are consequences to actions, and we have to recognize that.
Now, what about children that don't know something, they don't understand? They really don't know that, throwing that baseball at that plate glass window would do any damage. They wanted to play ball, and there was
it seemed like a good idea
to them, so they just
it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we have to restore them in a way that's not punitive. Children should be restored that way. In fact, everybody should be restored in a way that allows them to learn from their mistakes.
Sometimes, we have to try and put ourselves in their shoes and see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And that's not always possible.
No.
It's not always comfortable, for sure, as well.
Definitely.
I think it's fair to say that, forgiveness has many layers, and it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated, and we as humans, we like things to be a little more orderly. We like things to be a little more straightforward. But as you've all mentioned, there's many directions this can go into. Is, did someone really know? Were they a child? Were they, differently abled? All of these kinds of things play into this as we wrestle with that forgiveness. So I like how you all began this as casting the net wide about forgiveness, that Jesus was extending that petition to, I think, to all of these situations and scenarios.
It's all
For
people,
all of us.
yeah.
Yeah.
As Alexander Pope famously said, to err is human, to forgive divine, and Jesus shows us the divine way with his forgiveness.
So to make this even a little more complicated than it already is, why not? There are some biblical scholars who contest that this phrase about, forgive them for they do not know what they're doing, was actually not spoken in the moment from Jesus. And it was added to the Gospel of Luke by the author of Luke or somebody after the fact. So let's just, for the sake of wonder, let's imagine that is true. Why would you think that after the fact, why would that be added? Why would somebody think that needs to be said?
Well, Luke, of course, wrote at a time when Christianity was trying to appeal to the Roman Empire. And it might be that he thought of it, as a good way to show that the Romans were not really aware of what they were doing, or the soldiers, and then extending it even beyond that to the prelates and so on, that they were not aware of the significance of what they did. So it may be for that reason that it was added later. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. But it is not inconsistent with Jesus's teaching.
Right.
Because the Lord's Prayer has in it, forgive us our debts in one case, or forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So it's, I think, in a way that's consistent with what he says. There's another passage, for instance, when, and this is recorded both in Mark and in Matthew, where this man asks Jesus, what must I do? What good thing must I do to inherit eternal life? That's the way it is in Matthew. In Mark, it's interesting. The man says to Jesus, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?
Mm-hmm.
In that gospel, in Mark's gospel, Jesus replies, interestingly enough, there is no one good but God alone.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all in the same category as being sinful, being error prone.
I mean, Ralph, you point out that this is why it's always difficult to really understand the authorship of things and what was originally said and which was not, because you're right, it is very consistent throughout, especially the Gospels.
Mhm.
I mean, in I think it was Matthew 5, I think is that, and he was saying that, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
Mhm.
I mean, it's even Hebrew Bible Testament, there's throughout time, there is this theme of forgiveness. Yeah.
And it also says that if you don't forgive others, God's not going to forgive you. So that really puts it in a very serious way.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's serious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It puts it down where it rubber meets the road, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah. Comes right back. God knows it's at the end of the day, we think in terms of how does this affect me? If we were then to bring this statement to modern day times, and Jesus was here and said this in our lives and said the same thing and cried out in front of us to God to forgive them for they do not know what they are doing, who do you think he might be talking about and petitioning forgiveness for? Who are the them in that scenario?
Well, I think in that scenario, it might be the soldiers, because Judas knew what he was doing. And Pontius Pilate, I think, knew what he was doing, but the soldiers were just acting on orders.
And then how would you interpret this if you happen to be in a crowded room and today, like 2021,
Mhm.
and you heard Jesus say this? Who do you think he would be talking about?
Oh,
It's very tempting just to pick out somebody that you don't like.
yeah.
I'm not
You know
being-
that if we don't like
I
the
love that, ma'am. Oh, you're very so honest. I love that.
but Gretchen, I go back to what you said. To me, it's also the people who are taking advantage of the unprotected people and doing things to those. And that's what I find is very difficult to forgive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love your honesty because I'm right there with you.
Well, I always try to be better, but sometimes it doesn't work.
Is it possible that Jesus is talking to us? Was he talking to you?
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I pointed out earlier, in the moment, I really don't know what I'm doing, although I think that what I'm doing is a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, and we all think we're good people,
Yeah.
but
Right.
we're not good people to all other people. I know, unfortunately, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, I know when we were doing that study of the book on how not to be a racist, that he had made the statement that if you say you're not a racist, that's proof that you are a racist. And
Wow.
we all do sin against others without being consciously doing it, but it happens just because the way our society goes today.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that
I
becomes a little
remember-
uncomfortable when we think it might be us, huh?
Well, I remember one time, this was many years ago. My first wife died in 1989, but she taught me a lot of stuff before she died. And one of them was that one of the members of the church, I found out, was unhappy with me. He was offended by something that I had said. And my wife said, well, you should go and apologize. I said, well, I hadn't done anything wrong. Why should I go and apologize? She said, well, you don't have to say that you did something wrong. Just say you apologize for hurting his feelings or whatever. I said, but I didn't do anything wrong. She said, all right, now we've been married several years, right? Yeah. And she says, then she says, every now and then we get into an argument and I'll come and apologize to you. Yeah, that's right. She said, did you think that I thought I was wrong?
Well said.
That's a good one. Good one.
Yeah, so she taught me, she taught me that, I don't have to be wrong necessarily to apologize because somebody's feelings might be hurt, something that did it inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sorry that they're hurt feelings, but
Yeah. I was
And
told
so-
once that when someone tells you that you hurt their feelings, you do not get to tell them that they're wrong.
yeah,
It's good.
And I was like,
right,
okay,
yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
Well, I thank you all so much for delving into this. This is a difficult topic,
Mhm.
and I appreciate your words of wisdom and your reflections here. And thank you very much for spending this afternoon with me.
Were you there?